The carnival lights flickered against the October sky like dying stars, casting long shadows across the muddy fairgrounds of Millbrook County. It was 1984, and 7-year-old Tommy Brennan had been begging his parents all week to take him to the annual harvest fair. He wanted to ride the tilt-a-whirl, eat cotton candy until his stomach hurt, and most of all, he wanted to conquer his fear of the funhouse that sat at the far end of the midway, like a grinning monster made of plywood and paint. Tommy never made it home that night. In fact, he never made it out of the funhouse at all. For 40 years, his disappearance remained one of the most haunting, unsolved cases in rural Pennsylvania. No witnesses, no leads, no trace of the bright-eyed boy who had walked into that maze of mirrors and never emerged. The carnival packed up and left town 3 days later, taking its secrets with it, and Tommy Brennan became just another name on a missing child poster that slowly faded in post office windows across the state. But last month, something extraordinary happened. A demolition crew tearing down an abandoned warehouse in Pittsburgh made a discovery that would crack open one of the coldest cases in county history. Hidden behind a false wall, wrapped in plastic and duct tape, they found a single VHS cassette labeled in faded ink. Funhouse Security, October 1984. What that tape revealed was never supposed to see the light of day. Before we dive deeper into this chilling mystery, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Stories like Tommy's deserve to be remembered, and your support helps us bring these forgotten cases back into the light where they belong. The Millbrook County Harvest Fair had been a tradition for over 60 years. Every October, families from 3 counties would descend on the sprawling fairgrounds just outside town, drawn by the promise of caramel apples, carnival games, and rides that creaked and groaned with decades of use. It was wholesome Americana at its finest, the kind of place where teenagers held hands on the Ferris wheel and grandparents watched their grandchildren chase each other through the maze of booths and attractions. But in 1984, something felt different about the fair. Several vendors who had worked the circuit for years later described an undercurrent of unease that seemed to permeate the entire event. The weather had been unusually cold and wet, turning the fairgrounds into a muddy quagmire. 2 rides had broken down on opening night, including the carousel that had been the fair's centerpiece for decades. And then there was the Funhouse. The Mirror Maze. Funhouse had arrived with the Stellar Amusements Carnival Company, a traveling operation that worked small-town fairs throughout the Midwest and Northeast. Unlike the familiar attractions that returned year after year, this funhouse was new to Millbrook County. It towered over the other rides, a garish structure painted in swirling reds and yellows, with a massive clown face serving as the entrance. Children would walk directly into the clown's gaping mouth, disappearing into a labyrinth of mirrors, moving walls, and optical illusions. The attraction was run by a man named Vincent Corelli, a thin, nervous individual in his 40s who kept to himself and rarely spoke to other carnival workers. Those who did interact with him described Corelli as odd, even by carnival standards. He was obsessively protective of his funhouse, refusing to allow other workers inside, even for routine maintenance. He also had a peculiar habit of watching children from the shadows, studying their reactions as they emerged from his maze. Tommy Brennan had been fascinated by the funhouse from the moment his family arrived at the fair that Saturday afternoon. His parents, David and Margaret Brennan, had promised him he could visit every attraction, but Tommy kept returning to stare at the towering clown face with a mixture of fear and excitement. His mother later recalled how he had tugged at her sleeve, asking again and again when they could go through the funhouse. The family spent the afternoon enjoying the fair's more traditional offerings. Tommy won a stuffed elephant at the ring toss, shared a funnel cake with his younger sister Katie, and rode the bumper cars twice. But as evening approached and the neon lights began to pulse more brightly against the darkening sky, he could no longer resist the pull of the Mirror Maze Funhouse. At approximately 7:15 that evening, Tommy convinced his parents to let him enter the attraction. The Funhouse cost 2 tickets, and there was a small line of children waiting their turn. David Brennan paid Vincent Corelli directly, handing over $4 for 2 tickets. Corelli, who was working the entrance himself that night, barely looked up as Tommy joined the queue. What happened next has been pieced together from witness statements and police reports filed in the days following Tommy's disappearance. At 7:22, Tommy walked through the clown's mouth and into the Funhouse. The attraction was designed to take approximately 8 to 10 minutes to complete, with most children emerging either delighted or slightly disoriented from their journey through the maze of mirrors and moving walls. Tommy's parents waited patiently at the exit, watching other children emerge with wide grins and excited chatter about what they had experienced inside. 10 minutes passed, then 15, then 20. Margaret Brennan began to worry, suggesting to her husband that perhaps Tommy had gotten turned around in the maze and was taking longer than usual. At 7:50, after nearly 30 minutes had elapsed, David Brennan approached Vincent Corelli and asked about his son. Corelli's response, as recorded in the police report, was dismissive and strange. He claimed that all children who entered had already exited and suggested that Tommy must have slipped out when his parents weren't looking. When David insisted that they had been watching the exit the entire time, Corelli shrugged and said that children sometimes got scared and found other ways out. But there were no other ways out. The Funhouse was a closed system, with only one entrance and one exit. The walls were solid plywood construction, and the entire structure sat on a raised platform that would have made any unauthorized exit visible to dozens of fairgoers. Growing frantic, Margaret Brennan demanded that Corelli open the Funhouse so they could search for Tommy. Corelli initially refused, claiming it would be dangerous to allow people into the maze while it was still operating. Only when David threatened to call the police did the carnival worker finally agree to shut down the attraction and allow them inside. What they found defied explanation. The Funhouse was empty. Tommy was nowhere to be seen, despite a thorough search of every corridor, chamber, and hidden passage within the maze. The structure, which had seemed so complex and mysterious from the outside, revealed itself to be surprisingly simple on the inside. There were no secret panels, no hidden rooms, no way for a 7-year-old boy to simply vanish. The police arrived within minutes of being called, and the Funhouse was immediately sealed as a crime scene. Detective Ray Morrison, who had been with the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department for 12 years, later described the scene as one of the most baffling he had ever encountered. Every inch of the structure was examined, photographed, and documented. Officers crawled through ventilation shafts, checked for loose floorboards, and even brought in dogs to search for any trace of Tommy's scent. They found nothing. Vincent Corelli was questioned extensively that night, and again the following day. His story never wavered. Tommy had entered the Funhouse, and as far as he knew, the boy had exited with all the other children. He claimed to have been at his post by the entrance the entire evening, and insisted he would have noticed if a child had failed to emerge. When pressed about the layout of his attraction, Corelli provided detailed blueprints and even guided investigators through the maze multiple times. The carnival was scheduled to leave Millbrook County on Monday morning, but the departure was delayed as police continued their investigation. Every worker was interviewed, every vehicle searched, every piece of equipment examined for any sign of Tommy Brennan. The other attractions were dismantled piece by piece, revealing nothing but the expected machinery and framework beneath their colorful facades. The Funhouse itself was completely disassembled on Sunday, with investigators documenting every board, mirror, and mechanical component. What they discovered only deepened the mystery. The structure was exactly as Corelli had described it, with no hidden compartments or secret passages. There was simply nowhere for a child to hide, and certainly nowhere for a child to disappear. By Monday evening, with no evidence of foul play and no leads to follow, the carnival was allowed to continue on its route. Vincent Corelli and his Mirror Maze Funhouse left Millbrook County, along with the rest of Stellar Amusements, heading south toward their next engagement in West Virginia. The case of Tommy Brennan's disappearance was officially classified as an abduction, though investigators privately admitted they had no idea how such a thing could have occurred. The story should have ended there, filed away in the cold case archives alongside hundreds of other unsolved disappearances. But sometimes the past has a way of refusing to stay buried. For nearly 4 decades, the abandoned Riverside Industrial Complex in Pittsburgh had stood as a monument to the city's manufacturing decline. The sprawling warehouse facility, once home to a steel processing plant, had been shuttered since the early 1990s. Urban explorers and homeless individuals had used the buildings over the years, but for the most part, the complex remained untouched by time, slowly crumbling behind chain-link fences and no trespassing signs. Last month, the city finally approved demolition of the site to make way for a new mixed-use development. The demolition crew, led by foreman Jake Martinez, had been working methodically through the complex for 2 weeks when they reached Building C, a smaller structure that had once housed administrative offices. It was while tearing down an interior wall that Martinez's crew made their discovery. Behind what appeared to be a standard office partition, they found a narrow space that had been deliberately concealed. The area was approximately 4 feet wide and 8 feet long, just large enough for someone to move around in. But it was what they found inside that space that changed everything. Scattered across the floor were dozens of items that seemed completely out of place in an abandoned industrial building. Children's toys from the 1980s, including several stuffed animals and a collection of small plastic figurines. Candy wrappers and soda cans, their labels faded but still readable. A child's jacket, size small, with Tommy B written on the tag in black marker. And sitting in the center of it all, wrapped carefully in plastic and sealed with duct tape, was a single VHS cassette. The tape was labeled in Funhouse Security, October 1st, handwriting that was barely legible after decades of storage, 1984. Below that, in smaller print, were the words Property of V. Corelli and what appeared to be a date, 10/13/84. October 13th, 1984, was the night Tommy Brennan disappeared. The discovery sent shockwaves through the Pittsburgh Police Department and immediately caught the attention of the FBI's cold case unit. Agent Sarah Chen, who had been tracking unsolved child disappearances from the 1980s for over a decade, recognized the potential significance of the find within hours of receiving the initial report. She had Tommy Brennan's case file memorized, along with dozens of similar disappearances that had occurred at traveling carnivals throughout that era. The VHS tape was immediately transported to the FBI's Digital Forensics Laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, where specialists began the delicate process of transferring the decades-old footage to modern digital formats. The magnetic tape had degraded significantly over the years, and there were concerns that the content might be completely corrupted. But after 3 days of careful restoration work, the technicians managed to recover approximately 47 minutes of usable footage. What they saw defied everything investigators thought they knew about Tommy Brennan's disappearance. The tape began at 6:38 p.m. on October 13th, 1984, according to the timestamp in the bottom right corner of the screen. The camera was positioned high above the Funhouse entrance, providing a clear view of Vincent Corelli's ticket booth and the gaping clown mouth that served as the attraction's entryway. The quality was surprisingly good for a security camera from that era, suggesting that Corelli had invested in professional-grade surveillance equipment. For the first 20 minutes, the footage showed typical carnival activity. Children and teenagers approached the funhouse with varying degrees of excitement and apprehension. Parents handed over tickets and money to Corelli, who appeared exactly as witnesses had described him, thin and nervous, with darting eyes that seemed to catalogue every person who approached his attraction. At 7:06 p.m., a small group of teenagers emerged from the funhouse, laughing and pushing each other playfully. At 7:12, a young girl exited alone, looking slightly disoriented but unharmed. The camera captured her parents rushing forward to greet her, their relief visible even through the grainy surveillance footage. Then, at 7:21 p.m., Tommy Brennan appeared on screen. Agent Chen had seen hundreds of photographs of Tommy from the original investigation, but seeing him alive and moving on the surveillance tape was jarring. He was exactly as his parents had described him, small for his 7 years, with sandy brown hair and an oversized jacket that made him look even younger. He approached the Funhouse entrance with obvious excitement, practically bouncing on his toes as he waited in the short line ahead of him. The footage showed David Brennan handing money to Vincent Corelli and receiving 2 tickets in return. Tommy took the tickets eagerly and walked toward the Clown's Mouth entrance, pausing only once to look back at his parents with a wide grin. At 7:22 p.m. exactly, he disappeared into the Funhouse. This matched perfectly with the timeline established during the original investigation. But what came next had never been documented in any police report. At 7:24 p.m., just 2 minutes after Tommy entered the Funhouse, Vincent Corelli stepped away from his ticket booth and walked to a control panel that wasn't visible from ground level. The camera angle showed him manipulating several switches and dials, though the specific controls weren't clear from the surveillance footage. What was clear, however, was that Corelli was monitoring something inside his attraction with intense focus. For the next 15 minutes, the carnival operator remained at his control panel, occasionally making adjustments to various settings. During this time, 3 other children entered the Funhouse and emerged without incident. But Tommy Brennan did not appear at the exit. At 7:41 p.m., 19 minutes after Tommy had entered the attraction, something extraordinary happened. A section of the funhouse that had appeared to be solid wall from the outside suddenly opened like a hidden door. Vincent Corelli emerged from this concealed entrance, carrying what appeared to be a large canvas bag. The bag was roughly the size and shape of a small child. Agent Chen watched in horrified fascination as Corelli quickly carried the bag to a panel van parked behind the funhouse, out of sight from the main carnival area. The vehicle hadn't been mentioned in any of the original witness statements, likely because it was positioned in a service area where fairgoers wouldn't normally venture. The surveillance camera's angle didn't provide a clear view of the van's license plate, but it did capture Corelli loading the bag into the rear of the vehicle. He then returned to the funhouse through the same hidden entrance he had used to exit. The concealed door closed seamlessly behind him, once again appearing to be nothing more than a solid section of the attraction's exterior wall. 23 minutes later, at 8:04 p.m., David Brennan appeared on camera, approaching Corelli's ticket booth. Even without audio, his agitation was obvious from his body language and gestures. This marked the beginning of the timeline that had been established during the original investigation, when Tommy's parents first reported that their son hadn't emerged from the funhouse. The remainder of the tape showed the events exactly as they had been documented in police reports. Corelli's apparent confusion and concern, the arrival of law enforcement, the systematic search of the funhouse that revealed nothing. But now investigators knew why the search had been fruitless. Tommy Brennan had been removed from the attraction through a hidden exit that no one, including the police, had known existed. The discovery of the surveillance tape immediately reopened the Tommy Brennan case and launched a massive multi-state investigation. Agent Chen assembled a task force that included detectives from Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia, and Ohio, all states where Stellar Amusements had operated during the months following Tommy's disappearance. The investigation into Vincent Corelli's background revealed a troubling pattern that had somehow been missed during the original inquiry in 1984. Born Vincent Michael Corelli in Buffalo, New York, in 1941, he had joined the carnival circuit in the late 1960s after serving a brief prison sentence for burglary. He had worked for various traveling amusement companies over the years, always operating funhouse attractions and always keeping to himself. What investigators found most disturbing was a series of reports from other law enforcement agencies across the country. Between 1975 and 1990, At least 7 children had disappeared from carnivals where Corelli's Funhouse had been operating. The disappearances had occurred in different states and had been investigated by different agencies, so the connection had never been made. In each case, the missing child had last been seen entering a funhouse or mirror maze operated by Vincent Corelli. In each case, the child had simply vanished without a trace, despite thorough searches of the attraction. And in each case, the carnival had been allowed to leave town after a brief investigation that turned up no evidence of foul play. The pattern was so consistent that it seemed impossible to believe it was coincidental. Yet somehow, Vincent Corelli had managed to operate for over 15 years without anyone connecting the dots between his presence and the string of missing children. Further investigation revealed that Corelli had used the same basic funhouse design at every location, though he made modifications and improvements over the years. The attraction always featured a complex layout of mirrors and moving walls that disoriented visitors, and it always had what appeared to be a single entrance and exit. But according to the surveillance footage, there had been at least one additional concealed exit that could be used to remove someone from the attraction without being seen. The task force's next priority was locating Vincent Corelli himself, but this proved more challenging than expected. Stellar Amusements had gone out of business in 1991, and the company's records were incomplete. Several former employees were tracked down and interviewed, but most claimed to have had minimal contact with Corelli during their time with the carnival. One former worker, however, provided a crucial lead. Martha Henley, who had operated a cotton candy stand for Stellar Amusements from 1983 to 1989, remembered Corelli mentioning that he owned property in rural Pennsylvania where he stored carnival equipment during the off-season. She couldn't recall the exact location, but she remembered him saying it was near a place called Deer Creek. A search of property records in Pennsylvania revealed that Vincent M. Corelli had indeed purchased 43 acres of undeveloped land near Deer Creek in Westmoreland County in 1978. The property included an old farmhouse and several outbuildings, and according to county records, Corelli had continued to pay property taxes on the land through 2003. Agent Chen and her team obtained a search warrant for the Deer Creek property and arrived there on a cold morning in late November. What they found would haunt investigators for years to come. The peeling away in long strips that curled and twisted in farmhouse sat like a wound in the landscape, its paint the November wind. Tall grass had overtaken what had once been a front yard, and the windows stared out like empty eye sockets, their glass long since shattered or boarded over. Agent Chen stood at the edge of the overgrown driveway, studying the property through binoculars, while her team prepared their equipment. The silence was absolute. No birds sang in the bare trees that surrounded the farmhouse, and even the wind seemed muted, as if the very air around the property had grown thick with secrets. Detective Mike Harrison from the Pennsylvania State Police adjusted his vest and checked his sidearm for the third time in 10 minutes. He'd been working missing persons cases for over 20 years, but something about this place made his skin crawl. Thermal imaging shows the main house is empty, reported Agent Lisa Torres, looking up from her handheld scanner. But there's something interesting about the barn. The readings are inconsistent, like there might be rooms or compartments we can't see from the outside. Chen nodded grimly. She'd seen enough crime scenes to know that the worst discoveries often came from the places that looked the most innocent. The barn behind the farmhouse appeared unremarkable, just a typical rural outbuilding with weathered siding and a rusted metal roof. But if Vincent Corelli had been using this property to store more than just carnival equipment, that barn would be where they'd find their answers. The team approached the main house first, following standard protocol. The front door hung askew on its hinges, and years of weather had warped the wood so badly that it took 2 officers to pull it open far enough for entry. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. Dust motes danced in the pale shafts of sunlight that leaked through gaps in the boarded windows. The house had been abandoned for decades. That much was obvious. Furniture sat covered in white sheets that had turned grey with age and neglect. Family photographs still hung on the walls, their subjects long since faded to ghostly shadows behind cracked glass. In the kitchen, dishes sat in the sink, as if their owner had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. But it was clear that someone had been using the house more recently than the general decay suggested. In what had once been the living room, investigators found evidence of recent habitation: a sleeping bag, empty food containers, and a small pile of clothes that hadn't been there long enough to gather the same thick coating of dust that covered everything else. "Looks like someone's been camping out here," Harrison observed, photographing the makeshift living space. "Could be squatters, could be our guy." Agent Torres discovered something more troubling in the back bedroom. Pinned to one wall was a large map of the United States, marked with red pins in dozens of locations across the Midwest and Northeast. Each pin was accompanied by a small white label with dates written in careful block letters. October 1984, Millbrook County, Pennsylvania. August 1979, Cedar Falls, Iowa. September 1982, Wheeling, West Virginia. Chen studied the map with growing horror. There were 43 pins in total, spanning from 1975 to 1990. Each date likely represented another carnival, another town, another missing child. The scope of what they were looking at was staggering. "We're not just looking at Tommy Brennan," she said quietly. "We're looking at a systematic operation that went on for 15 years. The barn proved even more disturbing. From the outside, it appeared to be a simple agricultural building, perhaps 60 feet long and 30 feet wide. But when the team forced open the heavy wooden doors, they discovered that the interior had been extensively modified. The original open space had been divided into a series of smaller rooms and corridors, creating a layout that was eerily similar to the Funhouse design they'd seen in the surveillance footage. The construction was crude, but effective. 2x4 studs and plywood panels created walls that could be easily reconfigured or removed entirely. Some sections had been painted with the same garish colors that had adorned Corelli's traveling funhouse, creating a disorienting maze of reds, yellows, and electric blues that seemed to pulse in the dim light filtering through dirty windows. But it was the basement beneath the barn that revealed the true horror of what had happened at the Deer Creek property. Agent Torres found the entrance almost by accident, noticing that one section of the barn floor sounded hollow when she walked across it. A careful examination revealed a concealed trapdoor, its edges so perfectly fitted that it was nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The door opened on well-oiled hinges, revealing a set of wooden stairs that descended into darkness. The basement had been excavated by hand, carved out of the earth beneath the barn, with primitive tools and an obsessive attention to detail. The walls were lined with rough concrete, and a series of bare light bulbs hung from the ceiling, connected by extension cords that snaked back up to the barn above. What they found down there would haunt every member of the task force for the rest of their careers. The basement was divided into 6 small cells, each one approximately 8 feet by 10 feet. The walls were concrete block, and each cell had a heavy wooden door with a small window cut at eye level. The floors were bare earth, packed hard by years of use. In each cell, investigators found evidence of long-term habitation, makeshift beds, empty food containers, and personal items that clearly belonged to children. Cell number 3 contained a collection of items that made Agent Chen's blood run cold. A stuffed elephant, identical to the one Tommy Brennan had won at the ring toss on the night he disappeared. A small jacket with Tommy B. written on the tag in the same black marker they'd found in the Pittsburgh warehouse. And scattered across the dirt floor, dozens of photographs. The photos showed children in various stages of distress and captivity. Some appeared to have been taken recently after their abduction, showing frightened faces and tear-stained cheeks. Others documented longer periods of imprisonment, showing the same children weeks or months later, their expressions having evolved from terror to a kind of hollow resignation. Tommy Brennan appeared in over 30 of the photographs. The earliest ones showed him shortly after his disappearance, still wearing the clothes he'd had on at the carnival. But later photos revealed the progression of his captivity, showing him growing thinner and more withdrawn as time passed. The final photo in the sequence was dated December 15th, 1984, more than 2 months after his disappearance from the Millbrook County Fair. Agent Harrison found similar collections of photographs in each of the other cells, documenting the imprisonment and abuse of dozens of children over a span of nearly 2 decades. The scope of Corelli's crimes was far beyond anything investigators had initially imagined. They weren't just looking at a single kidnapping or even a series of isolated incidents. This was a systematic operation, a carefully planned and executed program of child abduction that had operated under the cover of a traveling carnival. The forensic team worked for 3 days to document everything found at the Deer Creek property. Crime scene photographers took thousands of images, evidence technicians collected hundreds of items, and specialists from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit began the grim task of trying to understand the psychology behind what they were seeing. Dr. Rachel Morrison, a forensic psychologist who had consulted on dozens of similar cases, spent hours studying the layout of the basement cells and the evidence found within them. Her preliminary assessment painted a picture of a predator who was both methodical and patient, someone who had developed his techniques over many years of practice. "This isn't the work of an opportunistic criminal," she explained to Agent Chen during a briefing on the 3rd day of the investigation. "Everything here shows careful planning and preparation. The basement construction, the cell layout, the photographic documentation, it's all part of a systematic approach that was refined over decades." The photographs in particular revealed disturbing insights into Corelli's methods and motivations. Many showed children engaged in what appeared to be forced performances, reenacting scenes or poses that seemed designed to satisfy some specific fantasy or compulsion. Others documented various forms of psychological manipulation, showing children who had clearly been broken down through prolonged isolation and abuse. But perhaps most chilling were the photographs that showed children who appeared to have adapted to their captivity, smiling or playing games as if their imprisonment had become normalized. These images suggested that some victims had been held for extended periods, possibly years, before whatever final fate had befallen them. The question that haunted every investigator was obvious, but remained unanswered. Where were the children now? The basement cells were empty, and there was no indication that any of the victims had ever been released or escaped. The property showed no signs of recent use, suggesting that Corelli had abandoned it years earlier. Agent Torres made a discovery on the 4th day that provided a partial answer to that question. While searching a storage shed behind the farmhouse, she found a collection of journals written in Corelli's distinctive handwriting. The entries spanned from 1976 to 1991 and provided a detailed record of his activities during those years. The journals were written in a matter-of-fact style that made their contents even more disturbing. Corelli documented his abductions with the same attention to detail that someone else might use to record a business transaction. Each entry included the victim's name, age, physical description, and the location where they were taken. He also noted behavioral observations, recording how each child responded to captivity and what methods were most effective for controlling them. The entry for Tommy Brennan was typical of the others. Subject acquired October 13, 1984, Millbrook County Fair, Pennsylvania. Male, age 7, brown hair, brown eyes, approximately 45 pounds, cooperative disposition, responds well to reward-based conditioning, separated from family at 19:22 hours, using standard Funhouse protocol, transport to facility completed without incident. Later entries documented Tommy's imprisonment in clinical terms that stripped away any trace of humanity. Subject continues to show signs of adjustment disorder, but is responding to behavioral modification techniques. Appetite has improved, and compliance levels are within acceptable parameters. The final entry mentioning Tommy was dated December 20th, 1984. Subject TB showing signs of respiratory illness. Condition deteriorating despite basic medical intervention. May require disposal if symptoms persist. There were no further references to Tommy Brennan in the journals. As investigators continued reading through Corelli's records, a horrifying pattern emerged. The journals documented the systematic abduction, imprisonment, and ultimate murder of dozens of children over a 15-year period. Each victim followed a similar trajectory: initial terror and resistance, followed by a period of adjustment as they adapted to captivity, and finally, either death from neglect and abuse or deliberate execution when they were no longer useful to their captor. The journals also revealed the location where Corelli had disposed of his victims' remains. In multiple entries, he referred to a place he called the Garden, describing it as a location approximately 2 miles northeast of the main property where he buried the children after they died. Agent Chen immediately organized a search team to locate this burial site. Using coordinates provided in Corelli's journals and ground-penetrating radar equipment, investigators began systematically searching the wooded area northeast of the farmhouse. They found the first grave on November 28th, just 3 days before Thanksgiving. It was a small depression in the earth, barely large enough for a child's body, hidden beneath a thick layer of fallen leaves and forest debris. The remains were badly decomposed after decades in the ground, but forensic anthropologists were able to determine that they belonged to a child between the ages of 6 and 8. Over the next 2 weeks, investigators located 17 additional graves scattered throughout the woods. Each burial site was marked in Corelli's journals with precise coordinates and brief notations about the victim interred there. The methodical nature of the record-keeping was as chilling as the crimes themselves, suggesting a level of organization and premeditation that bordered on the industrial. Forensic teams worked around the clock to excavate each gravesite and recover whatever remains could be found. The work was painstaking and emotionally devastating, as investigators slowly uncovered the physical evidence of crimes that had haunted them through case files and surveillance footage. DNA analysis would take months to complete, but preliminary examinations of clothing fragments and personal items found with the remains allowed investigators to identify several of the victims. A small sneaker with Michael K. written in permanent marker on the sole. A friendship bracelet made of colored thread that matched one described in a missing person report from 1987. A plastic toy dinosaur that a mother from Ohio recognized from photographs as her son's favorite possession. Tommy Brennan's remains were found on December 3rd in a grave site that corresponded exactly with the coordinates listed in Corelli's journal entry from December 22nd, 1984. Along with his skeletal remains, investigators recovered fragments of the jacket he'd been wearing on the night he disappeared, still bearing the Tommy B. label that his mother had sewn into the collar. Agent Chen stood at the edge of the gravesite as forensic technicians carefully excavated Tommy's remains, thinking about the 7-year-old boy who had walked into a funhouse 40 years earlier with nothing more than excitement about conquering his fears. The case that had begun with a single missing child had grown into something far more horrific than anyone could have imagined. But even as they recovered the physical evidence of Corelli's crimes, one crucial question remained unanswered. Where was Vincent Corelli himself? The property records showed that he had stopped paying taxes on the Deer Creek land in 2003, suggesting that he had either died or abandoned the area around that time. But there was no death certificate on file anywhere in the United States, and no record of him leaving the country. Agent Torres discovered a potential lead while reviewing Corelli's financial records. Bank statements from the 1990s showed regular deposits from various carnival companies, confirming that he had continued working the circuit even after establishing his base of operations in Pennsylvania. But the deposits stopped abruptly in October 1991, suggesting that he had either retired or changed his method of earning income. More significantly, the bank records showed several large cash withdrawals in the months leading up to his disappearance from the carnival circuit. The amounts were substantial enough to fund a complete change of identity, including new documentation and relocation to another part of the country. Dr. Morrison's psychological profile suggested that Corelli was unlikely to have simply retired from his criminal activities. Predators of his type rarely stopped of their own accord, and the methodical nature of his operations suggested someone who derived significant satisfaction from both the crimes themselves and the elaborate systems he had developed to commit them. "He's either dead," she told Agent Chen during one of their regular briefings, "or he's operating somewhere else under a different identity. Someone with his level of organization and planning doesn't just stop. He moves, he adapts, he finds new hunting grounds." The possibility that Vincent Corelli might still be alive, still operating, still taking children, added a new urgency to the investigation. If he had successfully changed his identity and relocated, there could be dozens of additional victims who had never been connected to the original crimes. Agent Chen expanded the task force to include investigators from across the country, focusing on unsolved child disappearances that had occurred at traveling carnivals since 1991. The pattern they were looking for was specific: children who had vanished from Funhouse or Mirror Maze attractions, with no witnesses and no evidence of how they had been removed from the premises. What they found was deeply troubling. Between 1992 and 2010, there had been at least 12 similar disappearances at carnivals across the United States. The cases had been investigated by different agencies in different states, and like the original Tommy Brennan investigation, none had resulted in arrests or convictions. But when viewed together, they formed a pattern that was eerily consistent with Vincent Corelli's known methods. In each case, the missing child had last been seen entering a funhouse or mirror maze operated by traveling carnival companies. In each case, the attraction had been thoroughly searched with no sign of the victim, and in each case, the carnival had been allowed to leave town after a brief investigation that produced no evidence of foul play. Most significantly, investigators discovered that several of these later disappearances had occurred at carnivals operated by a company called Dreamland Amusements, a traveling operation that had been active throughout the 1990s and 2000s. The company's owner was listed as Victor Castellano, a man in his 60s who operated a funhouse attraction that was remarkably similar to the one Vincent Corelli had used during the 1980s. A comparison of photographs showed that Victor Castellano bore a striking resemblance to Vincent Corelli, allowing for the natural aging that would have occurred over the intervening years. The facial structure was identical, and both men shared the same distinctive nervous mannerisms that had been noted by carnival workers and law enforcement officers. Agent Chen was convinced they had found their suspect, but proving that Victor Castellano was actually Vincent Corelli would require more than photographic comparisons. The FBI's forensics laboratory began analyzing every piece of evidence they could find related to the Dreamland Amusements Company, looking for fingerprints, DNA samples, or any other physical evidence that could definitively link Castellano to the Deer Creek crimes. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While reviewing the surveillance footage from the 1984 Tommy Brennan case, Agent Torres noticed something that had been overlooked during the initial analysis. In one brief sequence, Vincent Corelli could be seen handling coins while making change for a customer. The angle was perfect for capturing a clear image of his right hand, including what appeared to be a distinctive scar across his knuckles. Photographs of Victor Castellano, taken during a 2003 police interview in Nevada, showed the same scar in the same location. It was the physical evidence they needed to prove that the two men were the same person. The arrest warrant for Victor Castellano was issued on December 15th, exactly 40 years and 2 months after Tommy Brennan had walked into that funhouse and never emerged. Agent Chen coordinated with law enforcement agencies across 6 states, knowing that Castellano could be anywhere along the carnival circuit that stretched from Florida to Maine. The break came from an unlikely source. A retired carnival worker named Eddie Hutchinson had been following the news coverage of the Deer Creek investigation. and something about the photographs of Victor Castellano triggered a memory that had been buried for over a decade. Hutchinson called the FBI tip line on a Tuesday morning, his voice shaking as he described an encounter he'd had in 2009 at a small county fair in rural Georgia. "I knew something wasn't right about that guy," Hutchinson told Agent Torres during their phone interview. "He ran this Funhouse attraction, kept to himself mostly, but there was this one night when I saw him loading something heavy into his van. It was wrapped in canvas, about the size of a kid, you know. When he saw me watching, he got real aggressive, told me to mind my own business." Hutchinson had been working security at the Peach County Fair that year, and he remembered the incident because a 7-year-old girl named Amy Patterson had gone missing from the fairgrounds that same weekend. The local police had questioned everyone, including Castellano, but like all the previous investigations, it had gone nowhere. The carnival left town on schedule, and Amy Patterson became another unsolved missing person case. But Hutchinson had kept a journal of his years working the carnival circuit, and he still had detailed notes about that weekend in Georgia. More importantly, he had photographs. As the security guard, he'd been responsible for documenting any unusual incidents or suspicious behavior, and his instincts about Castellano had prompted him to take several pictures of the man and his operation. The photographs were invaluable. They showed Castellano's Funhouse in detail, revealing a design that was virtually identical to the attraction Vincent Corelli had operated in the 1980s. The same garish paint scheme, the same clown face entrance, even the same basic layout of mirrors and moving walls that had allowed children to vanish without a trace. More importantly, the photos showed Castellano himself, and the resemblance to Vincent Corelli was unmistakable. The man had aged, his hair had gone completely grey, and he'd gained weight around the middle, but the facial features were identical. The nervous mannerisms were there too, captured in candid shots that showed him constantly checking over his shoulder and avoiding eye contact with other carnival workers. Agent Chen immediately dispatched a team to interview Eddie Hutchinson in person and collect all the evidence he'd preserved from that Georgia of photographs, incident reports, and personal fare. The retired security guard lived in the carnival circuit. His basement had been converted into a small town outside Atlanta, in a modest house filled with memorabilia from his decades working archive of sorts, with filing cabinets full observations from hundreds of fairs across the southeast. "I always knew there was something off about some of these carnival people," Hutchinson explained as he led investigators through his collection. "Most of them are good folks, just trying to make a living, but every now and then you'd run across someone who gave you the creeps. Castellano was one of those guys, always watching the kids, always asking questions about which ones were there alone, or with just one parent." The evidence Hutchinson had collected painted a picture of a predator who had continued operating with the same methods that had served him during his years as Vincent Corelli. The Funhouse design was nearly identical, the victim selection process was the same, and even the timing of the disappearances followed the familiar pattern of occurring late in the evening when the fairgrounds were crowded and chaotic. Agent Torres found something particularly disturbing in Hutchinson's files. A series of photographs taken at different fairs between 2005 and 2010 showed Castellano's Funhouse at various locations across Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina. But what caught her attention was the evolution of the attraction itself. Each year, subtle modifications had been made to the design, improvements that would have made it even easier to remove children without detection. The entrance had been redesigned to include a secondary passage that wasn't visible from the main fairway. The interior layout tracks visible in several of the photographs showed that Castellano had been refined to include more blind spots and hidden compartments. Most significantly, tire parking his transport van directly behind the Funhouse, creating a loading area that was completely concealed from public view. He was getting better at it, Agent Chen observed grimly as she reviewed Hutchinson's evidence. 40 years of practice, and he was still refining his methods. The investigation into Victor Castellano's activities during the 2000s revealed a horrifying truth. At least 9 children had disappeared from fairs where his funhouse had been operating, spanning from 2001 to 2010. Like the earlier cases, each disappearance had been investigated by local law enforcement, but the connection between them had never been established. The victims followed the same demographic profile that Vincent Corelli had preferred during the 1980s. Children between the ages of 6 and 10, usually attending the fair with family members who would become separated in the crowd. Boys and girls in equal numbers, all of them small enough to be physically overpowered and transported without attracting attention. Amy Patterson, the girl who had disappeared from the Peach County Fair, where Eddie Hutchinson had witnessed Castellano's suspicious behavior, fit the pattern perfectly. She'd been 7 years old, attending the fair with her grandparents, who had lost track of her in the crowd near the Midway Games. Security footage from the fair showed her approaching Castellano's funhouse at approximately 8:30 in the evening, but there was no footage of her ever emerging. Agent Chen's task force began the painstaking process of tracking Castellano's movements during the years since he'd abandoned the Vincent Corelli identity. Financial records were sparse, but they managed to trace several bank accounts and credit cards that had been used to purchase fuel, food, and supplies along the carnival circuit routes. The pattern that emerged was both methodical and terrifying. Castellano had been operating continuously since 1991, following the same seasonal migration patterns that had characterized his earlier crimes. He spent winters in Florida, working the county fair circuit as it moved north through Georgia and the Carolinas during the spring, then continued into Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania for the summer season before returning south for the fall festivals. But there were gaps in his documented activities, periods of several weeks or months, when he seemed to disappear entirely from the carnival circuit. Agent Torres theorized that these gaps represented times when Castellano was disposing of victims or maintaining whatever facility he was using to replace the Deer Creek property. The breakthrough in locating Castellano came from an unexpected source. Social media posts from carnival enthusiasts and fair photographers had created an inadvertent surveillance network that documented traveling attractions across the country. A teenager named Marcus Webb had been posting photographs of carnival attractions on Instagram for several years, and his account included dozens of images from fairs throughout the Southeast. Webb's photographs were remarkably detailed, capturing not just the attractions themselves, but the people who operated them, the vehicles used to transport them, and even license plate numbers in some cases. When FBI analysts began reviewing his posts, they found multiple images of Castellano's funhouse taken at various fairs between 2018 and 2022. The most recent photographs were from October 2022, taken at the Harvest Moon Festival in Bladenboro, North Carolina. The images showed Castellano's familiar funhouse setup, complete with the clown face entrance and garish paint scheme that had remained consistent for decades. But more importantly, they showed the man himself, now in his 80s, but still operating his attraction with the same nervous intensity that had characterized his behavior for over 40 years. Agent Chen felt a mixture of relief and revulsion as she studied the photographs. Relief that they had finally located their target after months of searching, and revulsion at the realization that Castellano had been continuing his crimes well into the 21st century. How many more children had he taken during the years since Amy Patterson's disappearance? How many more families had been destroyed by his methodical predation? The Harvest Moon Festival had ended in late October, but carnival records showed that the same traveling company was scheduled to operate the Christmas in the Country Fair in Lumberton, North Carolina, beginning December 20th. If Castellano was still traveling with that carnival, they would have their chance to arrest him in less than a week. Agent Chen assembled an arrest team that included FBI agents, North Carolina State Police, and local law enforcement from Robeson County. The operation was planned with military precision, taking into account Castellano's history of violence and the possibility that he might have weapons or even hostages hidden in his equipment. The Christmas in the Country Fair was a small event, held in a church parking lot on the outskirts of Lumberton. Only a dozen rides and attractions had been set up, creating an intimate atmosphere that was very different from the large county fairs where Castellano had traditionally operated. But his funhouse was there, positioned at the far end of the midway, exactly as it had appeared in Marcus Webb's photographs. Agent Chen and her team arrived at the fairgrounds just after dawn on December 21st, an hour before the attractions were scheduled to open for the day. The morning was cold and grey, with a light mist hanging over the carnival rides like a burial shroud. The only sounds were the distant hum of generators and the occasional clang of metal as workers made final preparations for the day's activities. Castellano's funhouse sat silent and dark, its clown face entrance grinning maniacally in the pale morning light. The attraction looked smaller than it had in the surveillance footage from 1984, as if decades of use had somehow diminished its presence. But Agent Chen knew that appearances were deceiving. Behind that faded paint and aging plywood was a carefully engineered machine for child abduction that had been perfected over the course of 4 decades. The arrest team positioned themselves around the funhouse while Agent Chen and Detective Harrison approached the small travel trailer that served as Castellano's living quarters. The trailer was parked behind the attraction, connected to the main structure by a canvas awning that provided privacy from curious fairgoers. Chen knocked on the trailer door, her hand resting on her service weapon. "FBI, Vincent Corelli, you're under arrest." The response was immediate and violent. The trailer door exploded outward as a shotgun blast tore through the thin aluminum, missing Agent Chen by inches. Detective Harrison tackled her to the ground as a second shot rang out, the pellets peppering the side of the funhouse where they had been standing moments before. "Suspect is armed and firing," Chen shouted into her radio as she scrambled for cover behind a nearby game booth. "All units converge on the trailer." What followed was a tense 15-minute standoff as Castellano barricaded himself inside the trailer, occasionally firing through the windows at any law enforcement officer who came too close. The carnival workers and early fairgoers were quickly evacuated from the area, leaving the arrest team alone with their target in the empty lot. Agent Torres managed to get close enough to the trailer to attempt communication. "Vincent, this is over. We know who you are. We know what you've done. Come out with your hands up and nobody else gets hurt." The response was another shotgun blast that shattered the window of a nearby concession stand. "We found the graves, Vincent," Torres continued, her voice carrying across the fairgrounds. "We found Tommy Brennan. We found all of them. There's nowhere left to run." This time, there was silence from the trailer. Long minutes passed with no sound except the distant rumble of traffic on the highway and the whisper of wind through the carnival rigging. Agent Chen began to wonder if Castellano had taken his own life rather than face arrest and trial. Then the trailer door opened slowly, and an elderly man emerged with his hands raised above his head. He was smaller than Chen had expected, diminished by age and illness, but the facial features were unmistakably those of Vincent Corelli. The man who had terrorized families across multiple states for over 40 years was finally in custody. As Detective Harrison placed handcuffs on Castellano's wrists, Agent Chen read him his rights, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. "Vincent Michael Corelli, you are under arrest for the murder of Tommy Brennan and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. You have the right to remain silent." Castellano said nothing during the arrest process, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the fairgrounds. But as the agents led him toward their vehicle, he spoke for the first and only time. "You'll never find them all," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. "I've been at this longer than you know." Agent Chen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December morning. As they drove away from the Christmas in the country fair, she couldn't shake the feeling that their investigation was far from over. Vincent Corelli's arrest was just the beginning of a much larger reckoning with decades of crimes that had been hidden beneath the bright lights and cheerful music of America's traveling carnivals. The funhouse sat empty behind them, its clown face still grinning in the pale winter sun, as if it knew secrets that would never be fully revealed. The interrogation room at the FBI field office in Charlotte was deliberately sterile, designed to strip away any sense of comfort or familiarity that might allow a suspect to maintain psychological defenses. Vincent Corelli sat across from Agent Chen and Detective Harrison, his weathered hands folded on the metal table, his eyes still carrying that same distant expression they'd seen during his arrest. For the first 3 hours, he said nothing. Standard questions about his identity, his activities, his knowledge of the missing children were met with complete silence. Agent Chen had interviewed hundreds of suspects over her career, and she recognized the signs of someone who had spent decades preparing for this moment. It was Detective Harrison who finally broke through Corelli's defenses, using a technique that caught even Chen by surprise. Instead of pressing for confessions or details about specific crimes, he simply placed a photograph on the table. Not one of the crime scene images or surveillance footage they'd been using in their presentations to prosecutors and media briefings. This was different. It was Tommy Brennan's school picture from 1984, the same image that had appeared on missing person flyers and milk cartons across Pennsylvania. A 7-year-old boy with tousled brown hair and a gap-toothed smile, wearing a striped shirt and looking directly at the camera with the kind of innocent confidence that only children possess. Corelli's eyes flickered toward the photograph, then quickly away, but not before Chen caught the reaction. Something had shifted in his expression, a crack in the facade he'd maintained for decades. His name was Tommy, Harrison said quietly. Thomas Michael Brennan. He liked dinosaurs and wanted to be a paleontologist when he grew up. His favorite color was green, and he was afraid of the dark, but too proud to admit it. He collected baseball cards and had a dog named Scrappy, who waited by the front door every day after school. Corelli's hands moved slightly on the table, his fingers drumming a nervous rhythm against the metal surface. You remember him, don't you? Harrison continued. October 13th, 1984. He was so excited about that funhouse, kept talking about how he was going to be brave, how he wasn't going to let it scare him. He trusted you, Vincent. He trusted the carnival, trusted that it was a safe place for children to have fun. For the first time since his arrest, Vincent Corelli spoke. They all trusted, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. That was the point. Trust makes everything easier. Agent Chen felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to remain still. After 40 years of silence, Vincent Corelli was finally talking, and she couldn't afford to do anything that might shut him down again. Tell us about Tommy, she said gently. Tell us what happened that night. Corelli was quiet for a long moment, his eyes now fixed on the photograph. When he spoke again, his voice carried a strange mixture of pride and regret that made Chen's skin crawl. He was perfect, Corelli said. Small enough to control, old enough to be interesting, and he came alone to the funhouse, which was unusual. Most of them brought friends or siblings, which complicated things. But Tommy, he walked right up to my booth by himself, so excited he could barely stand still. The confession that followed was methodical and detailed, delivered in the same matter-of-fact tone that had characterized Corelli's journal entries from the Deer Creek property. He described the hidden mechanisms built into his funhouse, the concealed exit that allowed him to remove children without detection, the canvas bag he'd used to transport unconscious victims to his van. The funhouse was perfect cover, he explained, his fingers still drumming against the table. Parents expected their children to be disoriented when they came out, maybe a little scared or confused. If a child took longer than usual, they just assumed the maze was more challenging. By the time they realized something was wrong, we were already miles away. Agent Chen forced herself to take notes, documenting every detail of Corelli's confession, even as her stomach turned at his casual description of kidnapping children. The clinical precision with which he described his methods was somehow more disturbing than emotional outbursts or expressions of remorse would have been. Detective Harrison placed another photograph on the table. This one showed Amy Patterson, the 7-year-old girl who had disappeared from the Georgia Fair in 2009. Like Tommy's picture, it was a school portrait, showing a smiling child with pigtails and a pink dress. Amy Patterson, Harrison said. Peach County Fair, September 2009. Tell us about Amy. Corelli's eyes moved to the new photograph, and something resembling a smile played at the corners of his mouth. Amy was special, he said. She reminded me of one from the early years, maybe 1978 or 79. Same hair, same curious nature. She asked so many questions when she first arrived at the facility. Wanted to know where she was, when she could go home, why her grandparents weren't coming to find her. What facility? Chen asked, though she already suspected she knew the answer. I had to replace Deer Creek, Corelli said. After the heat died down from the Pennsylvania investigation, I knew I couldn't keep using the old place. Too risky. So I found somewhere new, somewhere more remote, somewhere the screaming wouldn't bother the neighbors. The location Corelli described was in rural North Carolina, approximately 60 miles west of Charlotte, in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. Like the Deer Creek property, it consisted of an abandoned farmhouse and several outbuildings on isolated acreage that he'd purchased through a shell corporation in the early 1990s. But this facility was more sophisticated than its predecessor. Corelli had learned from his decades of experience, incorporating improvements that made the property more secure and harder to detect from outside surveillance. Underground bunkers replaced the crude basement cells, connected by tunnels that allowed him to move between buildings without being seen from the air. How many children did you take there? Agent Chen asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Corelli was quiet for a moment, his eyes moving between the two photographs on the table. I stopped counting after 50, he said finally. Numbers became less important than the experience itself. Each one taught me something new, helped me refine the process. The confession continued for another 4 hours, with Corelli providing details about dozens of abductions spanning from the 1970s through the 2010s. He described his victims with the same clinical detachment he'd shown in his journals, reducing children to collections of physical characteristics and behavioral traits that had made them suitable targets. Some of the cases he described matched unsolved disappearances in the FBI database, allowing investigators to finally close cases that had haunted families for decades. But many others were completely unknown to law enforcement, representing children whose disappearances had never been reported or investigated. Vincent Corelli died in federal custody 3 months after his arrest, taking countless secrets with him to the grave. But Tommy Brennan's story, and the stories of dozens of other children, finally had an ending. The VHS tape that sat hidden for 40 years behind a warehouse wall became the key that unlocked one of America's most horrific serial crimes, proving that sometimes the past refuses to stay buried. If this case taught us anything, it's that evil can hide behind the most innocent facades, and that justice, no matter how long delayed, will eventually find its way into the light.